I wish I was a cabin boy aboard a man of war. Sam's gone away aboard a man of war. Pretty work, brave boys, pretty work, I say. Sam's gone away aboard a man of war.
Hi, I'm Samuel Siegel, Executive Director of the Schooner Pursuit Historical Society. And today we're going to discuss the privateer timeline during the Revolutionary War. Before we get started, this project is something that we started about 4 years ago when we first came together, wanting to learn more about privateers of the American Revolution. A subject that is often overlooked. There's a few misconceptions, and there are a lot of unknowns about this particular subject, although more is being found out every day. So if you'll indulge me in a look at this particular timeline, we're going to break this up into 6 separate segments. The first of which is pre-revolution from 1772 till about April of 1776. And with that, let's get started. So, June 9th, 1772, something that has come to be known as the Gaspee Affair. Almost 3 years before the Revolution started, there was the HMS Gaspee, which was a customs schooner that was dispatched to off the shore of Newport, Rhode Island to go up and down the coast, making sure that everything was compliant as far as collecting funds from the 7 Years' War previous to that, because, well, the king needed his taxes, as did Parliament. This particular day, they ended up coming across a packet ship called the Hannah. They ordered her to heave to, and she declined. So, the Gaspee, in turn, decided to give chase and wound up beached upon one of the sandbars there just off the coast, which is now known as Gaspee Point. The people being sick of the commanding officer of the Gaspee, who was known for being rough, I guess one could say, with the citizens of that colony. Lieutenant Duddingston, whom ended up being, I guess, the recipient of poorer tidings because of his own particular actions towards the colonists at that time. The gist of it being that the colonists burnt the Gaspee down to the waterline, and thus started, or I should say furthered, really, that particular message of, we're not going to take this. Now we're going to move a little bit ahead in the timeline. About a year and a half later in Boston, December 16th, 1773. Everybody knows about this particular thing. We all learned about it in elementary school, the Boston Tea Party. Now, Bostonians at the time were very sick of the taxation without representation. More specifically, the Stamp Act and the Tea Act and those things, which had just come into effect May earlier that year. Important dignitaries that we ended up learning about decided to gather and discuss and meet and basically protest everything that was going on. Well, it ended up creating one of the more interesting civil unrest stories of pre-revolutionary America, because it ended up, what resulted was a group of men decided to dress up as Native Americans and take over one of the 3 ships that were stuck on the port there with all the tea involved, and then they dumped it into the bay there, and that created all sorts of havoc to come on in the future. But those 2 specific examples were what kind of set everything in motion as far as leading up to this next historic event in our timeline. After the Boston Tea Party, King George III had implemented something called the Intolerable Acts. Basically, it was implementing a ban on the importation of gunpowder and arms to the colonies because he did not want them in a revolt. Well, basically everybody at that point, they were fed up with the king, so gunpowder was in short supply. As it was hard to get a hold of with the ban. There was a blockade going on so that the importation could not happen from other channels. It basically set up Lexington and Concord. It was a perfect firestorm, and the tinderbox that was already started basically ignited on that day. Now on to August 23rd, 1775. King George III had declared the colonies in an open state of rebellion and sedition and made preparations to send more of his regular troops over to squash this little rebellion. So there's this need for gunpowder and provisions for Washington's army. And what General Washington does next actually provides the British with fuel to start one of the probably largest misconceptions about privateers during the Revolutionary War, at least that I can think of. So in September, Washington decided that he was going to hire 3 schooners and then man them with men from the 14th Massachusetts, also known as Marbleheaders. Now, the British had stated that they were privateers, and even some of our own colonists that were for the cause of liberty subscribed to that. But in truth, it was civilian-owned vessels that were leased to Washington's army. They were not privateers. But nonetheless, rumors are a beautiful thing in this case. So that helped, one way or the other, us win the war, but at the same time, it also provided some inaccuracies that people mostly like to think of as fact. On October 5th, 1775, the Rhode Island delegates had brought to Congress something that they were discussing in their General Assembly. Now, this idea was an unheard of subject before this. Nobody had ever thought about doing this, and that was to build up an American fleet and dispatch a couple of ships to intercept the incoming ships from Britain that were getting ready to deliver troops and supplies ready to plunder and squash this rebellion. People who opposed this called it, quote, the most wild, visionary, mad project that had ever been imagined, end quote. Of course, after a very hotly debated course, Congress did decide to approve that and commission 2 ships, as well as another 2 ships later that month towards the end of October on the 30th. On November 10th, 1775, the Continental Marine Corps was established. On November 25th, 1775, the Continental Navy was officially established. Two days later, on November 27th, was when the push for privateering began. Just 2 days after Congress had approved and formed the Continental Navy, on November 27, 1775, Simon Dean wrote his brother, who served in Continental Congress as a representative of Connecticut, and asked about privateering, for he was approached by gentlemen in his community regarding that same topic. Now, this was debated in Congress for 4 whole months, during which time various states and colonies and some influential citizens that were involved in government at that time took it upon themselves, and the colonies as well, taking it upon themselves, instead of waiting for Congress, decided that they were going to go ahead and start privateering without congressional approval. Now we're in January of 1776. On the 23rd of that month, the HMS Blue Mountain Valley was captured off the coast of Little Egg Harbor, New Jersey, by privateers. On March 23rd of 1776, the Battle of the Rice Boats begun. British set fire to supply ships, and the local militia ended up holding their positions. The British won a tactical victory, but the Continental forces won a very strategic victory. On March 25th, 1776, Congress authorizes privateering as a suitable cause for liberty. March 27th, 1776, the Pennsylvania Gazette publishes the resolution on privateering, and this sparks off a very lucrative industry throughout the rest of the Revolution. On April 11th, 1776, the first 2 privateers officially sanctioned by Congress were the privateer schooners Chance and Congress, both coming out of Philadelphia, which were the first 2 out of almost 1,700 during the course of the war. Now, a couple of things about privateers that are not covered in the timeline per se, but they definitely are important nonetheless, is the documentation that one must carry in order to be a said privateer, which are your letter of marque and reprisal, signed by Congress, and your instructions, basically your rules of engagement. Now these two documents must be kept together at all times. Otherwise, we're just a pirate. Piracy was alive and well at that time. But the difference between a pirate and a privateer is a privateer has documentation from a particular government. Thank you for joining me. Hope to see you next time.
I wish I was a cabin boy aboard a man of war. Sam's gone away aboard a man of war. Pretty work, brave boys, pretty work, I say. Sam's gone away aboard a man of war. I wish I was a gunner aboard a man of war. Sam's gone away aboard a man of war. Pretty work, brave boys, pretty work, I say. Sam's gone away aboard a man of war.